An Ordinary Battalion at War, the story of the Second Battalion Essex Regiment in the Great War. Episode 11, Holding the Line. In episode 10, we had seen the tail end of the Battle of the Second Battle of Ypres in the Belgian town, and the 2nd Essex were just to the northeast, holding the line as we can see on this map here. The battle may officially finish in the eyes of the people that decide the official dates for the battles, but for the 2nd Essex, their period of time in the line here was still going to continue to involve a lot of fighting. They're still in the same sort of area, around the area of Turco Farm, Canadian Farm, and Forward Cottage, No Man's Cottage, and so on, all places that were mentioned in the previous episode. And one of the casualties that was suffered in the period of them holding the line was Lieutenant Nigel Bavin. Nigel Bavin was in charge of B Company, and in late May was killed by artillery fire whilst in his dugout within the trenches. Now, one of the people to witness this was Arthur Oscar Hornung. Now, Arthur literally had joined the company on the day of Nigel Bavin's death, and in his own letters to his parents, he writes of going down the line to see the company commander, but when he got there, all he found was his feet. And this rather macabre story matches up with another correspondent that we have, Robin Monypenny, and in his writings, which are shown in Karen Farrington's book, A Brothers Out in Arms, he describes the situation as well. So this is Monypenny talking. Before arriving there, I had a telephone message from the CO, Lieutenant Colonel Jones, now properly promoted to his proper rank, to send B Company Commander's body, that's Bavin, down to him as it had been decided to start a cemetery near Ypres. When I got to B Company and asked about the late company commander, I was told there was nothing left of him. On examining his dugout, I found that this was probably true, but there appeared to have been no attempt to try and find some of him or his belongings. I took this as not a very good sign of the spirit of the company. So, Monypenny insists that the dugout in which Bavin had been sleeping is checked, and bear in mind what we heard from Hornung about the feet being found. Monypenny continues. And he told me to send the remains down in a sandbag and they would be buried in the new cemetery. I'm afraid there was more earth than anything else in that sandbag. And the cemetery in question is New Irish Farm Cemetery, which is just outside the town of Ypres. Nigel Bavin, the officer that we're talking about, was a son of the late Benjamin Bavin, and he was from Norwich, and his father was a solicitor. Nigel had been born in Norwich in May 1896, educated at Stubbington House Fareham, Norwich Grammar School and Berkhamsted, and was gazetted to the Essex Regiment from the Special Reserve of Officers in August 1914. And, as we already know, was killed by a shell on the 23rd of May 1915. And here we can see his gravestone in New Irish Farm Cemetery. So returning to Robin Monypenny, his viewpoint of Hornung, who we've just seen, was quite interesting. Now, Arthur Hornung, his dad was E.W. Hornung, who was the author who wrote the Raffles story, and his uncle was Arthur Conan Doyle, famous for the Sherlock Holmes stories. So Robin, talking about Arthur Hornung, he was a nice boy, full of fun. He had picked out as his Batman a lad who had been educated at a very good public school, but he'd been the bad boy of his family, and he'd enlisted in the line regiment before the war. Even now he was inclined to be up to scrapes. One day he was sent with a ration party. He did not come back with it. Hornung was naturally agitated about this, wondering whether he had deserted. I told Hornung that I did not think he would do that, and that he was either wounded, killed, or would turn up later, in which case he must have a reasonable excuse. He turned up hours later with half a dozen bottles of champagne, which he had found in some broken-down cellar in Ypres. Now, the man they're talking about now is a Private Crump, and it would appear he went to Charterhouse School. Now, Bavin is killed by shell fire in the lead up to a period of heavy attacks upon the 2nd Essex line. And they're in an area near Turco Farm, which is marked in a little red box on this map, and they're holding the line across to an estaminet and towards Canadian Farm, which is in the sort of turquoise blue box. Now, Noel Irwin, who we've met many a time before, gives some information about what it was like in the lines at the time. Our nerves and powers of resistance were more seriously strained 3 weeks later. This is him talking about the 23rd, 24th of May 1915, in this same sector, when under cover of a very concentrated gas cloud, the Germans attacked Canadian Farm, and that was within that blue square that we saw in this slide. So concentrated was the gas that the grass in the short intervening space of 80 to 100 yards between the opposing trenches was dyed completely yellow by the chlorine. The enemy failed to gain a single yard. The most staunch devotion to duty was shown, particularly by one platoon of my company, throughout the intense ordeal of not only withstanding the terrors of gas, but also of beating off the infantry attack launched at close range. It was in recognition of the successful defence by the battalion during these few weeks' fighting, and particularly for the operations of the 2nd of May, that I was lucky enough to be awarded one of the first military crosses given to the battalion, and in fact one of the earliest in the war. And the military cross only came into effect on the 1st of January 1915, and Irwin's talking about the occasion when he took the reserve company back into the line during a gas attack, which is mentioned in a previous episode. So the battalion is scattered across the area, which we can see in this picture now, taken from Google Earth. The picture's taken from approximately the position of the support line, looking towards Turco Farm, which is again in the little red box. And the sort of area just to the right of the map on the horizon would be where the Estamony was, and just on the very right edge, if not off the edge, is the area where Canada Farm would be, or Canadian Farm would be. So Robin has now taken over the company after Bavin has been killed, and he makes a few notes about the men that he's encountering. I discovered a corporal by the name of Clark. Naturally, his nickname was Nobby. All Clarks seem to be called Nobby. A big, bluff, ginger-haired individual. I could not understand why he was not being made a sergeant. He was one of the Monypenny compares him to some of the other corporals in the regiment who he's not a big fan of. But during the fighting all day on the 24th of May, he was splendid. In the advance in the early morning, he and his men were the first to leap out, and he helped to rally most of the men. He'd voluntarily taken charge of the bombers on our right front, and that's talking about hand grenades, and led the men forward several times when they were inclined to be downhearted. I got him promoted to sergeant and also recommended him for a medal, but I never learnt whether he received the latter or not, and as far as I can tell, he doesn't. But Sergeant Clark is obviously, again, one of these men who is willing to take the fight to the enemy and who will lead others in the fight and then hopefully will bring others along with them. But speaking of this fighting on those days, we continue with Robin Monypenny. Now, the positions to the side, to the right side, to the Shell Trap Farm area next to the Essex are being overrun in these German gas attacks and infantry attacks. It's always the unit next to them that gives way, isn't it? But in this case, they're told to fall back to lines around the area of the support line where this photo has been taken from. And so I hurried back, explained the situation to my NCOs, collected the machine guns, small arms ammunition and wounded, and moved back in echelon formation, one platoon covering the next. We went back with our bayonets fixed and ready, and as silently as possible. My left flank facing the rear, so that would be on the right-hand side of this picture. My left flank facing the rear tumbled right into some Germans, and short work of thrusting and jabbing ensured in the darkness. And he eventually gets his men back into the trench and talks about he almost got stabbed by one of his own soldiers with a bayonet. Now, the 2nd Essex are pretty much spent by now, and there are accounts in Monypenny's writings and also in Hornung's letters, which talk about some of the men kind of giving way under the stress and the strain, particularly of the artillery fire. And in one bit, which it's not 100% clear where he's talking about, Robin Monypenny gives us the following extract, that whilst they're under attack, it then, quote, dashed madly to the rear, shouting, "Retire, retire." Nobody else budged. Everybody looked back in blank surprise. For a moment I was bewildered, but not so Sergeant Nobby Clark. He went up over the back, cursing them and blazing at them with his rifle. I do not think he hit them, but the poor creatures were later rounded up by the battle police, and to be caught by the battle police generally meant a court-martial resulting in a firing squad. And Hornung, in his letters, he talks about having to use his revolver, at times to try and encourage some of the men because they're so sort of downbeaten by the experience of the shelling, the gas, and the constant being in the line. because if you remember from the previous episode, the 2nd Essex had been getting pulled out of the line just before they were told to drop their kit bags, turn around and head back in on the 13th of May. And so after defending the line and controlling this retreat back to the support lines, which in itself is actually mentioned in the official history of the Great War, the British official history of the Great War, after this, the 2nd Essex are brought out of the line for a short period of kind of rest and recuperation and to take in reinforcements. And they are moved back to dugouts near the canal, which runs northwards from Ypres. So kind of it would be off to the left-hand side of this picture, probably a mile or two away. So they're still not completely at rest and they're still not completely in safety. However, it's not long before they're back into the line, and again they return to the area of Turco Wood. And Robin Monypenny, in his account, talks about them taking over trenches in Turco Wood. It generally seems to be referred to as Turco Farm on most of the sources. And what we've done with this map is we've used like an overlay and removed it slightly, so you can see where the modern roads run, and you can see landmarks such as No Man's Cot Cemetery just about in the top left-hand corner. So it's quite possible there were woods around Turco Farm, as that might be what the hatching on this picture shows. So whilst they're in this area, there's a long period of trying to fix up the trenches, or indeed make trenches, because some of them were just dugouts and were not held very fully. And it's a case of getting by the best that they can. And so now we have one of Hornung's letters to his parents. This is dated the 9th of June 1915. Crump got me some fresh eggs and milk from a neighbouring farm behind the canal. Priceless servant, what? And then he carries on. Now, he's obviously a very young man, and when he was at Eton, he was very into sports. He was the captain of sports. He played, I think it's football and a number of other things. And you can almost picture this kind of young, keen to fight, keen to show himself to be a man individual. And Monypenny, who is like the senior hand now in the company, isn't much older himself, but Hornung seems to be particularly kind of young-spirited. And so on the 19th of June, he writes to his family, talking about some more adventures in this area. Yesterday, the CO wanted a bombing party to go out from B Company to see what it could do. I had bagged the job weeks ago and have been reconnoitring in front of our lines all this past week with a view to a scrap some night. So last night I got a party, 2 NCOs and 1 man armed with hand grenades, and myself with some of the new hand bombs. Glorious things, just the size and weight of a cricket ball. So he's talking about Mills bombs here, I'm guessing. Then at 12:30 this morning, as in just after midnight, we got over the parapet and sailed over the intervening 200 yards. Of course, I had planned the whole direction on the spot to aim at, etc., so we got up to 50 yards of the old Boches without difficulty, going in single file, myself at the head, and laying out in the wrong grass we could distinctly hear Fritz breathing hard over his spade work. They were digging. I'd previously arranged with Delamere, who's another platoon commander in the company, that he should send a series of flares up to show me exactly where I was, and so beat the Boche at his own dirty game. The difficult part lay in getting within 20 yards of them, for the hand grenades are difficult to hurl much further with any accuracy. At any rate, we waited for, there's a bit more, but I'm jumping ahead now. At any rate, we waited for a few minutes while more flares went up, and then after gauging the distance, I let off with cricket ball number 1. It was just like throwing in from cover, a fast long hop. Only this time I had some batsmen to run out, and there was a price on those stumps. I fancy things happened in their trench, as there were howls and a bit of Luddite flew back and hit me just under the ear. Mere scratch. Only it spoilt my old coat for ever and ever, amen. The others then stood up and threw in, the wicket-keepers put them down nicely, and we made haste back to the pavilion. It was a case of appealing against the light, for it was 1:30 a.m. by then, and getting uncomfortably light. And this is one that he writes up, and he writes a letter to his family telling them about his exploits here. But he's not the only one. Monypenny writes about carrying out raids and taking part in them. And he talks about one occasion where they kind of go into the German trenches. Now, when in his account in Karen Farrington's book, it sounds like it's quite a large affair, 2 companies, but there's no reference to this action in the war diary or the regimental history. Neither was there to Monypenny's, Hornung's exploits either. So we'll have to kind of take it as we find it. So this is Monypenny talking again about attacks from around Turco Farm and towards the Estamini, which is marked in green on this map. Then the first line made a rush into the German trenches, scrambling through and over the wire and hurling bombs. The second line stayed just before the wire and hurled a shower of bombs until a whistle was blown by the officer in charge, who was to judge when the front line would be in danger from those bombs. This, of course, needed fine judgment and was a tricky operation. It's quite possible that some of our bombs did cause some of our own casualties. And he talks about when he's in the trench, he comes face to face with a German and manages to take them prisoner, and that they take a couple of prisoners and bring them out. And this is why I think maybe this might be a mixture of memories, because there's no record of the 2nd Essex taking any prisoners at this time. Now, Hornung, in his writings, go taken us into late June and early July 1915. Talks about how his platoon is in a trench that goes around the Estamini, which is, remember, the writing in the green box, and the building itself is actually in the sort of bottom left corner, and that his trenches run in front of it, the Estamini is behind it, and that they have to spend quite a bit of time attacking a place called No Man's Cottage, which is out to the front of them, because the Germans are using it as an observation area, and the Germans in turn are attacking it because they think that the British are using it as an observation area. And so we know that they're in and around this area for quite some period of time. Now, unfortunately, on the 8th of July 1915, Hornung is killed whilst in the trenches, and it's a case of some shell fire comes onto their position, and Hornung is wounded in this exchange. And so I'll kind of give you some of the accounts that are written about this, and these come from a book called Trusty and Well Beloved. And this book was actually written by Hornung's father, who you remember was the author that invented the gentleman sort of burglar Raffles. And it's a memorial book, which was quite a common concept at the time, to get together letters about the soldier that had died, to get people to write about them. And there's a number of different bits and pieces that are sent to the family and then make it into this memorial book. So this is from what is listed as Sergeant Major Clark. So he seems to be moving his way up, and he'd been Oscar's platoon sergeant, Old Man Clark, as he's described in Oscar's letters. So this is Sergeant Clark writing to the parents of Arthur Hornung, who was his platoon officer. I must say, sir, your dear son, died like a gentleman and a soldier. He was always to the front, and a braver man there never was. His thoughts were always for the men under him, and to their comfort he was always seeing. And there was no one more sorry to lose him than his platoon and myself. He was a promising officer, and if he had continued in the service, we'd have had a fine career before him. On several occasions he himself organised bomb-throwing parties and proceeded within a few yards of the German trenches. And I know on a couple of occasions he must have done considerable damage and confused them, as they were rather quiet afterwards for some time. I might mention, sir, that your brave son lies in a quiet spot beside more of his comrades on the famous battlefield of Ypres. I served all through the South African War, but was never in such a place as that, and I am not sorry to say, sir, that I have left that place for another along the line. And basically the 2nd Essex are taken out of the line in July 1915 and find themselves moving south towards the Somme, where they're going to spend much of the next year or so. Another thing that's listed in the this memorial book, Trusty and Well Beloved, is a letter that comes from a general officer, and there's no clue to who this officer was. But this is again talking about Hornung after his death. His platoon were wild with grief as they worshipped him. The men said he was absolutely fearless and was employed on all sorts of jobs, machine guns, bombs, patrols, etc. Anyone knew him will recognise the boy at Eton. He revelled in every hour of his life at the front, just as he had a life in general. He lies buried in a cemetery made by the Essex Regiment, behind a farm which goes by the name of Turco Farm, on the east side of the Ypres Canal. Now, this sort of sporting spirit, this combative spirit, had obviously led Hornung to take patrols out into no man's land. He'd also got hold of a French rifle, and letters to his parents he talks about trying to snipe at the Germans, and on one occasion writes to say that he'd hit somebody, but he describes it as somewhere in France, and then he goes on to explain that that person won't be able to sit down for a while, so shows perhaps the close range at which the fighting was going on. Another person that is mentioned in this was Crump. You remember that private who was acting as a servant and stretcher bearer, but had been to Charterhouse, a famous public school. Well, Crump was killed a few days before Hornung was, and he was hit by a sniper, bearing in mind that Hornung's attempts to be a sniper. Now, whilst the letter from this general officer to Hornung's parents says that he was buried behind Turco Farm, Hornung's grave is not known now, nor is Crump's, and they are both commemorated on the Menin Gate in the town of Ypres on the panel. I've marked in red both of their names, but you'll see some other names on there that will be familiar from previous episodes. Barrell, who was killed in early May, and he had been commissioned from the ranks of the 1st Essex and come across to the 2nd Essex. Company Sergeant Major Tippler, who had been involved in the fighting at Shell Trap Farm, he was one of the 12 that had stayed in the line when most of the people had fallen back. He was with Captain Peshar. And then we go further down into the sergeants, just to pick one out. We've got Sergeant John Cousins, who was from the machine gun section and who'd been fighting and working the machine gun around the moat of Shell Trap Farm. So for the 2nd Essex, Ypres, and particularly 2nd Ypres, is somewhere that's kind of bonded into their kind of memory. But for now, they're leaving there and they're going to be heading towards the Somme. And that is where we'll pick them up in the next episode.